In South Vietnam, the biggest demonstration for 6 years. 20,000 Catholics staged this rally outside the City Hall in Saigon to protest against the draft treaty agreed between Hanoi and Washington that could end by giving the communists a share in the government of the South. Most of the demonstrators were Catholics who'd fled the North in 1954 after Vietnam was partitioned. Now they're worried about their future, and there are plenty of other religious and political groups who are equally concerned. The mood in Saigon in recent weeks has hardened considerably against the terms of the draft treaty, which was, after all, agreed without reference to South Vietnam. President Thieu, who bitterly opposes the treaty, has been doing his best to inspire the people with some patriotic fervor. For the first time since the peace talks began with Hanoi 4 years ago, South Vietnam's flag is being sold in Saigon streets. In Saigon, the flags are being displayed prominently on buildings as a sign of personal support for the president. Elsewhere in the country, they're being used as a means of identifying those areas which retain their loyalty to the government. The main stumbling block to the treaty is, of course, President Thieu himself, and he takes every chance he can to speak out against the agreement. One of his bitterest attacks came on National Day after he'd honored Vietnam's war dead in the traditional manner by laying a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier. The president resents the fact that a treaty was concluded without him, that it does not demand the complete withdrawal of all North Vietnamese forces from the south as a prerequisite for peace. He insists that any ceasefire would be abused by the communists, and he objects to the proposed National Council of Reconciliation because it might lead to a coalition government. He's repeatedly stated he will not share the government with the communists. Pausing amongst the graves, the president made clear his determination to hold out for the terms he wants.
And when I see the widows, the orphans, when I see so many tombs, so many sacrifices for the freedom and liberty of Vietnam, I reaffirm again that the whole people of South Vietnam will resist again any peace which demand the rendition of South Vietnam and which will give the South Vietnam to the communist aggressors.
People are calling you the obstacle to peace, Mr. President.
When it's a just peace, a guaranteed peace, there's no one single obstacle in Vietnam. There will be, as long as it's a non-just peace, a surrender peace, a peace which gave the South Vietnam to the communists, who asked the South Vietnamese to surrender the communists. There will be not only one Thieu, but 7.5 million Thieu who are against that.
Whatever President Thieu may think about the treaty, it's clear that for the Americans, the war is nearing its end. This is Long Binh, situated 170 miles north of Saigon. It's the biggest American military base outside of the United States, and it's just been handed over to the South Vietnamese. The base was established 7 years ago, and at the peak of operations in 1968, it was home for 50,000 American troops. The handing over of the ceremonial key symbolized the end of direct American involvement in the war. 2,000 Americans will remain at Long Binh for several weeks to instruct the South Vietnamese in the use of the $100 million worth of facilities which they'll inherit. In preparation for their departure, the Americans are not only handing over their bases, but also large supplies of arms. The world's biggest plane, the giant C-5A transporter, flies into Saigon airport with the latest shipment, in this case, helicopter parts. These airlifts have been going on for the past month, and now South Vietnam has the 4th largest air force in the world, with well over 2,000 planes and scores of helicopters. Only Russia, China, and America itself have more. The arms build-up is being carried out by both sides. The communists are rushing supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, while most of the American ground equipment arrives by sea. One clause in the draft peace treaty states that military supplies must be limited to replacements only, and the Americans are careful to point out that these supplies of artillery and heavy armor are not meant to increase the number of South Vietnamese divisions in the field, but to make up for the serious losses sustained during the big communist offensive last spring. When the shipments are complete, the South Vietnamese will be better off by 100 armored personnel carriers, scores of long-range field guns, and nearly 70 tanks. This map shows the present military situation in South Vietnam. The darker shaded areas are controlled by the communists. In South Vietnam, this amounts to 1/3 of the land, but only 1/10 of the people. The stars show the main areas of communist guerrilla activity. Of course, talking about peace has not stopped the fighting. On the contrary, in certain strategic places, the level of fighting has actually increased as both sides try to gain as much territory as possible before a ceasefire is proclaimed. According to American intelligence, Hanoi has moved all its combat divisions into South Vietnam, presenting a formidable military problem to the Saigon government. But the immediate problem lies much closer to home, along Highway 1 and Highway 13, where the communists control a number of villages and hamlets within 20 miles of the capital. After weeks of fierce fighting, the Saigon government says it's regained most of them, but admits the communists are still in a strong enough position to threaten Saigon itself. As the battle for territory continues, villages caught in the crossfire are reduced to rubble. This one on Highway 13 was a battleground for 10 days before the South Vietnamese finally succeeded in dislodging the communists. The war hasn't been ruinous for everyone. To a small minority of South Vietnamese, it's brought prosperity. For these fortunate few, places like Saigon's Cercle Sportif are islands of quiet luxury amidst the noise and bustle of the capital. Local and American businessmen can sit around the pool for a quiet talk or drink, and the war seems a long way away. Many fortunes have, of course, been made legitimately. but there's inevitably been corruption as well, with American aid funds finding their way into many private pockets. Socially, too, the war's been a distorting factor. Prostitution flourishes in hundreds of seedy clubs and bars, although it's now declining as the Americans leave for home. Saigon also has a thriving black market with street stalls stacked with American and Japanese goods. It's the most obvious and visible example of the economic dislocation which the war has brought. The money to be earned in Saigon, either honestly or dishonestly, has been a magnet for thousands of South Vietnamese peasants and the surrounding countryside. Others have come for the comparative security which the capital offers, but many have found neither livelihood nor security and have ended up in refugee camps like this on the vulnerable outskirts of the city. Although they provide at least some sort of shelter for the homeless, the camps can cope with only a fraction of the problem. It's estimated that the war has uprooted some 5 million people. After so many years of suffering, it's hardly surprising that hopes for a purely military solution are now receding in the South. More and more people are wondering whether it's not worth trying to end the war at almost any cost, even if it does mean bringing the communists into the National Assembly in a coalition government. A coalition would, of course, be a major political victory for the communists. But would it work? One man who's sure it wouldn't is Tran Van Thieu, who negotiated South Vietnam's terms in Geneva in 1954.
No, I never think, and I think that all the people in Vietnam never believe that can work, because we have had a very bad experience in 46, 45, when in Hanoi against the French, Ho Chi Minh formed a coalition government with all the Nationalist Party and the Communist Party. After 2 or 3 months, they managed to eliminate all their adversaries, all their opponents, and they have to fly to China abroad. So you see, the coalition government cannot work, and sooner or later they will take over South Vietnam.
But Hanoi has promised that as part of this deal, they will not overthrow the Saigon government.
Can you believe in the promise of Hanoi? Have they ever kept their promise? Never, never. We cannot trust the communists.
You're suggesting that if they came to form a part of a coalition here, they would immediately attempt to overthrow the present government?
Certainly, certainly. You already have the documents seized on the prisoners, the VC prisoners. They already have that scheme to resume the guerrilla warfare once after they sign the ceasefire.
What will happen to the government here? What will happen to you if the Americans sign over your heads?
We must accept the fact because we cannot force the Americans to sign unilaterally a ceasefire. Because if President Nixon were to take back all the GIs and interrupt the war, we cannot force them. But then we'll face alone. We'll continue to fight alone.
You will have the safeguard of an international control commission here, won't you, if you accept the ceasefire?
We already have had the experience of the ICC from 64 to now. I cannot believe, I don't believe on the effectiveness of the international control.
Why not? But you have to have some kind of control commission.
But what's the effectiveness? You have seen in the past with the ICC. Now, whatever the composition.
Well, what kind of safeguard would you accept?
Safeguard? We already said that in case of ceasefire, we want the withdrawal of all North Vietnamese troops. all foreigners, American or Vietnamese, all foreign troops must go home.
But the Viet Cong would still remain because they are South Vietnamese.
The Viet Cong, but not with their arms. They must drop their arms. We accept the political fight, but not military fight.
It's only when the struggle does eventually move from the military arena to the political one that South Vietnam will be able to make any headway with its economic difficulties. For the last 10 years, the country has lived off aid programs from the United States, and it's just not used to paying its own way. Last year, for example, South Vietnamese exports were worth only $8 million, whilst imports stood at nearly $400 million. And the American withdrawal can only make matters worse, since American military spending has been a major source of revenue for South Vietnam. Whether the war ends quickly or not, South Vietnam will probably have to learn how to live with decreasing amounts of American aid. The only way it'll be able to do so is by increasing the scope and efficiency of its own industries. This factory makes ceramics, one of the few remaining industries which are dependable sources of exports. Rubber and textiles are others. In one way, the war has actually helped by speeding up the process of industrialization in certain parts of the country. Despite the corruption, US aid programs have created new industries such as plastics and introduced many Vietnamese to industrial jobs and the administration that goes with them. But taking the country as a whole, the war has been an enormous drawback, cutting off the natural flow of investment capital from private sources. Perhaps the brightest hopes for South Vietnam's economic future lie in the countryside. Although the war has taken farmers from the fields and destroyed thousands of acres of standing crops, agricultural production is actually higher now than 5 years ago. A lot of the credit's due to new strains of rice introduced by the Americans, which have doubled and sometimes tripled traditional yields. With the war over and the peasants back in the fields, South Vietnam could reasonably expect to earn a good living from its agricultural exports. Just how soon the war ends will depend on how soon President Thieu can be persuaded to agree to terms for a ceasefire. But there are some people who fear that even if a ceasefire were agreed on, it would soon become unworkable because it would take the pressure off the Viet Cong, who would then mount a campaign of provocation and assassination. The result, it's claimed, would be chaos, from which the communists would be the first to profit. With these problems in mind, we asked Mr Tran Van Do if he thought that a ceasefire now would enable the South to make a start on the enormous task of economic rehabilitation.
Ceasefire on such conditions, the rehabilitation is impossible, as I told you, with the sabotage. It takes a year to build a factory, it takes 15 minutes to blow it. So no one accept the risk to invest here. You have seen that for 18 years, since 54, we have had the assistance for all the free world, yeah, especially from the United States. And you have seen, we have inflation, galloping inflation. We have the cost of living rise every day. Scale. The same thing will happen again.
You're very much a pessimist, Mr. Van.
No, I am not pessimist. I am not pessimist. We'll try our best to face the situation, but we must organize our self-defense without the assistance of the United States. But I think that the future is very, not very clear, but it's very dim at the moment.
Can you see South Vietnam going it alone in this war if the Americans do withdraw?
We are forced to do so. We are forced to do so.
And can you see South?
If the South Vietnamese do decide to carry on the war on their own, they'll need all the toughness and resilience for which the people of both halves of Vietnam are renowned. Fortunately, there are signs that despite the ravages of the war, the people of the South will be able to pick up the pieces again. Even in the most devastated villages, life is slowly starting up once again. Over the last 10 years, the war in Vietnam has claimed 1.5 million lives, with many millions more wounded. Families have been broken up, and the whole structure of Vietnamese society has been shattered. For this generation, the future will be harsh, no matter what the politicians eventually decide. For 2 decades, the peasants of South Vietnam have watched the troops of both sides race back and forth across their land. Their overriding concern is to see the war end. And although at heart they're probably no keener than the politicians in Saigon to see the communists take over, many of them would no doubt take the risk if it meant a real chance of peace and stability. And it's this growing disaffection with the fighting as such that President Thieu will ultimately have to reckon with if he decides to soldier on alone.